Patricia Lamb from Westminster then is our first speaker, and we'll be speaking about female professors, contradiction in terms, question marks. I think we've had a number of comments about your title already, so let me.
Okay. First, I want to apologize to those speakers this morning and the early one this afternoon whose sessions I did not attend for some good reasons which I won't go into now, all fairly hysterical and crisis-ridden. So what can I say? I have two caveats to begin with. First, note that the title of my talk, as Phyllis said, is a question and not a statement. Second, the topic is so huge and so complex that in the time available, I can really only touch on a few generalities and point them up with some anecdotes, both my own and others. I'm not going to bring up the questions of women academics with children, women academics who are married, single, none of that at all, just women in academia. Let me address myself to my title. I phrased it as a question because the answer is a matter of perception. That is, from what vantage point you are looking at the phenomenon of women in the academy. To an old guard, old-fashioned, and I hope practically extinct, male member of a college or university faculty, indeed the answer would be yes. It is a contradiction in terms. To many modern, younger, male or female academics who have been shaped by the sensibilities of the past 20 years, the answer is supposed to be no. And there exists a lot of ambiguous ground along the spectrum in between these two poles of people. But aside from the people who inhabit our world, what of the subject matter itself? I am a literature teacher. I am a professor of English literature. The word professor comes from the Latin and means a public teacher. Beyond that, the word profess means to declare openly, to avow, to affirm. From the root words meaning before or in front of, and to confess or avow, etc. So I get up publicly in front of my classes, and I confess, avow, etc., the substance and meaning of my discipline. Its subject matter. Indeed, as all of us do every class hour. Easy enough to consider. You put together class notes from critical readings. You make up a reading list or your syllabus from the great accepted works of the sacred canon of English literature. You cheat a little and go back to your old graduate school notes. And you read through the great journals of one's discipline. But all of these sources do not exist sui generis. They were all written, culled, decided upon by someone or other. I'm sure you all see where I'm going from here. Let me dramatize these vague generalities with a story from my graduate school days, one which I'm sure that every woman academic can produce such a story from one of her own classes from dear old grad school. In a class on literary critical theory at a prestigious institution in the Northeast, I was scribbling dutifully away as the professor took us through the intricacies of contemporary literary critical theory. This critic being a man full of honors, the one who wrote the book that we were going through, full of honors and years at Columbia University until his recent demise. Unregretted by self. Well, chapter 8 of the book we were doing covered the literary analysis of Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex. Its opening sentence is engraved on my brain. It goes, quote, "As we all know, this is chapter 8 of a major literary critical text published by a guy who had an endowed name, incredibly important chair at Columbia University." Okay, quote, "As we all know, from time to time, we have all wanted to kill our fathers and sleep with our mothers." So, scribble, 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 wait just a minute. I scribbled out half of these words down, then suddenly I was struck by what should have been obvious to the man who wrote the book, let alone to a generation of readers. As modern parlance would have it, what's this wee stuff, paleface? The critic was actually writing of only half of, I started to say the human race, but really only of Western culture, and not my half at that. Except for a lesbian friend to whom I once related this story. She laughed and said, "Hey, sounds good to me." I couldn't resist that. It's true, it's true. But seriously, addressing oneself to the scholarly apparatus around one's subject is very likely often to make one feel like a contradiction in terms. See, I can get serious occasionally. So how can I, in all conscience, get up in front of a class, both male and female students, and teach such stuff? And the answer is that I cannot, and so I do not. Because what that critic was making was not a statement of literary interpretation, but a political statement based on the assumption that a universal we would be understood and accepted by the not-we's, I should say not us's, that is to say women, would be understood to designate the important, that is to say the real, members of the Academy. So, one goes in search of interpretive texts unlike such blatantly silly leftovers from the past. They are available, and it is not difficult to find them now, and it is a joy to use them. One can, therefore, resolve one of the contradictions of the Academy in classroom terms. What about the canon itself, that is, the primary texts of the great literary tradition of Western culture? True, much of it until very recently has been comprised of the artistic recording and passing on of a tradition in which women's lives and women's realities, women's perceptions are simply not there. As if all women who have ever lived, with the exception of a queen or two, a few courtesans, mistresses scattered around here and there, had all sunk without a trace, along with Atlantis, to the bottom of the sea, perhaps sunk again with each generation. Not only are the women as real people simply not there, but what too many, most perhaps, of the writers in the canon reveal is the profound distrust and resentment of our sex, often a misogyny that is so deep as to make it very difficult to teach them with any passion or involvement. Again, to profess through teaching, say, the satiric and misogynist poetry of Byron, and not launch into a denunciation of such a hateful attitude as his, is a tricky balancing act. But I do it as best I can, because there is simply not time in a broad undergraduate survey course of the Romantic period in England there is not time to trace the psychological development of a Byron, to place him and his Don Juan firmly in the context of Regency England, and so on. So, another contradiction forced on the professor by the terms of the canon we are bound to teach. That is, that I feel bound to teach to students who must have more familiarity with Byron and Shelley than with Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, or Aphra Behn, or Fanny Burney for their own future careers, if they go into graduate school, if they are going to be teachers themselves. So we engage daily, we women, academics, in the transmission of a culture, a canon, that is only partly our own, and that limits so much of women's experience. So where does the canon arise? Who says what is the canon, and what shall be, what and who shall be in it? Who says what and who shall not be in it? Well, the members of the established order, of course, those who establish and maintain all canons. In the case of my own discipline, here's another little story. A week ago on the television quiz program, Jeopardy, which we're all watching here with great interest, needless to say, a woman contestant was introduced. This is just about a week or 10 days ago. A woman contestant was introduced by the genial host, Alex Trebek, as a research scholar. He asked her what her present research was, and she replied that she was writing a book on English women playwrights of the 18th century. He looked mildly surprised and asked, "Oh, were there any? Perhaps 2 or 3?" She looked mildly annoyed and said that there had been a good many very popular in their day, but at their deaths, their plays apparently died along with them and were wholly unknown and certainly neither performed nor published anymore. We are now discovering, through the diligent efforts of women scholars in all fields, that the same fate has been meted out to women artists, women composers, women historians, scientists, etc., and certainly my own field of scholarship, women explorers and travelers in Africa. They were productive and famous and thoroughly professional in their day. They were completely forgotten and never mentioned in another book or footnote or index after their deaths. In short, they are not inner of the canon. They cease to have existence. And until very recently indeed, one will find virtually no mention of them in histories or commentaries on the discipline, even the most complete and exhaustively done ones. But I hope you didn't think this was all going to be grumble, grumble, grumble. But the winds of change are blowing through the paper corridors of even that venerable institution, practically a canon in its own right, the Norton Anthology of English Literature, and all the other Nortons as well. One can squash in just a little bit of Lady Mary, of the Countess of Winchelsea, and of others who have made their ladylike ways into the 4th and even the more recent 5th editions of the Norton. And I might say one of the reasons being that so much pressure was put on the editors, who are all from my old graduate school. I have addressed myself thus far primarily to the matter of what I teach, and I do not think that there can be much difference in any of the liberal arts and most of the social sciences. I cannot speak for the physical sciences, although, cynic that I am, I suspect that there is indeed a male and a female, biology, for instance, particularly after I finished reading Evelyn Fox Keller's recent biography of Barbara McClintock, which was called A Feeling for the Organism, which I most highly recommend to everybody here. Be that as it may, let me leave the topic, the subject matter of one's discipline, and look briefly at two other major focuses of an academic's life. First, the students to whom we profess, and second, the institution in which, if we are lucky, we find a position, and if we are very lucky indeed, keep it. What little I have read in women's studies literature about the students we teach is focused mostly on observations that women students speak up more in all women classes, and that men students tend to take over when in a mixed class. My wholly subjective response to this sad situation is that it seems to me that it has changed radically over the past decade and a half or so. I find even in a rather conservative institution and area of the country, that is to say here, that nowadays a good many, well, I'm trying to be polite, that nowadays a good many women students are as likely to raise their hands, speak up, disagree, and so on, as are the men. I really have seen that in the 10 or 11 years I've been here. And I may be mistaken, but it seems that is the case to me. I don't know what other people's perceptions are. And it surprises me a great deal, I might say. But what of one's attitude, what of the attitude toward what one is doing? What are the attitudes students have towards females in charge? Here, let me discuss briefly the difference between a teacher and a professor. I am here citing Jessie Bernard, the noted sociologist. She says that face-to-face teaching, if it is strictly information conveying, has become anachronistic. Motivated people can learn by reading materials themselves. The so-called teaching boxes can, in fact, do the job of this kind of teaching faster and better than the human teacher. Much more than teaching, however, is involved in the atmosphere of a good college or university. There must be people around who are enthralled by their subjects. Students must learn that there are people vitally interested in ideas, people to whom ideas are important. There have to be people who profess, who debate, who argue, who stand for something, who live their subject. It is worthwhile for the student to know that there are such people in the world, not that he or she will necessarily take them as models. Students in most universities will not. In later years, however, the student as board member, executive, or voter will know that there are people desperately attached to certain values and that these values are good and must be protected. Bernard goes on to distinguish between the professor, one who professes what he or she believes in terms of the subject, and the, quote, what she calls the man of knowledge, the academic who is creative, original, and productive in his or her own field. She says that the naive person does not understand the difference between the function of the man of knowledge role. Now, Bernard uses this deliberately. I don't want to, upset anybody. She says that the naive person fails to understand the difference between the function of the man of knowledge role and the teacher role. The naive person raises a hue and cry when he or she finds something contrary to the accepted patterns of thought in the community. This is not what they pay teachers to do. It is the academic person performing the man of knowledge function who is most likely to have problems with academic freedom. Indeed, it is the institutionalization of academic freedom which alone makes possible the performance of the man of knowledge role at all. Without it, the man of knowledge role would be assimilated by the teacher role. What she is talking about, of course, is the role of tenure in the academy. And I will deal with this and women academics in just a moment. One great difficulty with this distinction is that the acceptance by students of a woman as a man of knowledge is problematic and often leads to a denigration of the discipline itself in the minds of the students. Are there certain disciplines that are more female than others, more masculine? In a female discipline, quote, are students, whether graduate or undergraduate, more likely to accept the dicta and mentorship of a woman, a man, either one, without question? Here's an oblique little tale which sort of supplies a backwards answer to that question. My graduate institution, the only Ivy League university to my knowledge to have a College of Home Economics, decided in the radical chic early 70s to upgrade its quaint frilled apron, napkin folding into fancy shapes image of home economics and make it sound more scientific, tougher, real. And it was changed to the College of Human Ecology. And guess what? For the first time in its long and honorable history, it was given a male dean in place of a female for the first time in 100 years. It had become respectable. The discipline had become respectable from home economics to human ecology. It had become an accepted part of those segments of the applied sciences that exist in large universities. Needless to say, the new College of Human Ecology became very popular with male students for the first time in its history, and it became increasingly difficult for women professors to gain tenure. In fact, there was a class action suit at Cornell that lasted for a decade and was won by the women plaintiffs who had long since ceased to give a damn because they'd gone on to other institutions in order not to starve to death. It took 10 years. We can only guess at the attitudes that our students, women and men alike, bring initially into the classroom, at the ways in which they might assess the importance, the significance of the subject matter that we are transmitting to them, at those ways perhaps based on our gender, our clothing, our hairstyles, our accents, our personal eccentricities, even perhaps the relative pitch of our voices, high or low. It has, for instance, been indicated by several surveys that any audience takes a female speaker more seriously the lower the pitch of her voice is. And the same applies to the male voice also, except that the norm of serious voice pitch or seriousness is much higher. A man can have a higher voice. A man can have a tenor voice and be taken seriously. A woman really has to be a contralto and go way, way down at the bottom, you know, until she's taken seriously. This is true. This is true truth. So let us assume that students learn soon simply to ignore dress, hairstyle, etc., and to listen to us. What are they hearing? A professor? A teacher? A woman? A person of knowledge? A famous survey of students' attitudes done about 20 years ago, and forgive me, I cannot recall the names and the statistics, but I'm sure half of you must know this, proved conclusively that students, both male and female, simply take men in our culture more seriously. The testers gave a copy of an identical scholarly article to the students in several classes and asked the students to assess the quality and significance of the article. Some students were given the article as having been written by Dr. John Smith. The rest were given the article as having been written by Dr. Joan Smith. The identical article, I repeat. Not surprisingly, most students, both male and female, thought Dr. John's article pretty nifty on all counts, but Dr. Jones was pretty weak and unconvincing. Same article, okay? Well, I myself find it hard to believe that attitudes as deeply ingrained as this test demonstrates can have changed all that much in 20 years. Superficially, perhaps, but I think there's a long, long way to go. I said I was going to touch upon the institutions in which we are paid to profess. The groves of academe have too often become the graves of academe for many aspiring women. One must be hired in a full-time tenure-track position. At large institutions, one must publish. In the sciences, one must get grants, lab space, and lab assistants, usually in the form of graduate students, and one must always get support from the establishment. And finally, one must be awarded tenure. Or else one cannot profess. One then teaches. Emily Abel's recent book, which is called Terminal Degrees, states it only too clearly, quote, "Over the past 15 years, the occupational structures of colleges and universities have been undergoing fundamental revisions that were highly relevant to the people most subject to them. Those scholars who never quite made it into the ranks of the tenured, who never quite met with the approval of their colleagues, but instead served as that army of sub-employed which comes close to comprising half of the teaching staff at less prestigious institutions of higher learning, and is increasingly substituting for both full-time regular teachers at even elite universities. Those scholars who teach the lowest level courses for the least pay, and are precisely those who had in an earlier era been all but excluded from the professoriate. A new academic proletariat was born, and it was populated mainly by women." Unquote. She writes of how the academic system, especially in the upper rarefied reaches of the great universities, operates to exclude both women and minorities from tenure, let alone from the great endowed chairs. An increasingly widespread system of informal arrangements has come into being, which has locked more than half of women in higher education into low-level dead-end jobs. Quote, "What is the nature of those," this is still Emily Abel, "what is the nature of those jobs that are increasingly found on the margins of academe? Their description reads not unlike that of all the other marginal jobs women have been required to take if they are to earn wages. They pay considerably less than a living wage, and most often the pay comes by the course than simply as a prorated fraction of a full-time salary. There are in the majority of cases no benefits, no health insurance, no retirement, and in most cases no offices and no desks. I literally used to meet my students at one place I taught like this before I had my PhD on the stairs, on the staircase in a building, because I had no desk, I had no table, I had no office, I had no nothing. And that's the way it goes, and I'm sure a number of you in here have gone through the same experience, and some are even now going through it. One cannot profess in these circumstances. One simply teaches. But one is barred from the courses that allow a full profession of the discipline. Another contradiction in terms. It should be noted that what Abel is talking about here includes women in the sciences as well as women in the humanities. I have said little about women in the sciences in academia. Let me conclude with a few observations on them. There have been, at a rough estimate, about 3 times as many recent books concerning women in science as there have been about academic women in general, or the liberal arts in particular. The reason is not hard to find. The road for the woman in science has been a hard, hard road, long and lonely and very often tragic. One awful statistic, for instance, the suicide rate for the woman chemist is 5 times that of the suicide rate for white women in the general population, just for instance. I can do no better than to cite Vivian Gornick's recent book, Women in Science, Portraits from a World in Transition. One of her central findings is that career development has been virtually non-existent for women scientists. These women have spent most of their working lives frozen in position as permanent research associates, dependent upon the labs, the projects, the funding, and the ambitions of others. The principal investigators, who are almost always men and very often their own husbands. Without status, without power or alternatives, these women have had to settle for peripheral places in their professions in order to do the work they loved. Reacting to this situational inequity, the younger women express the anger that fuels change. Among the older women, there is residual bitterness. In the words of an Ivy League scientist recently tenured in response to the demand of younger feminist colleagues on her campus, quote, "I worked here 23 years alongside many men who knew my work was certainly as good as theirs, and often," she's from Harvard, by the way, "and often superior to theirs, and research associate was all that was ever permitted me. I hate the bastards. They've taken the heart out of science for me." Excuse me. Unquote. Women in science have experienced assault on the very core of their identity, both as serious scientists and as serious women. Consider, for instance, the graduate admissions interview of a woman who today, at 35, is a successful, highly granted geneticist running her own lab. When she applied with outstanding credentials, including undergraduate publication, to do graduate work at Stanford at the height of the Vietnam War in 1967, she was cursorily addressed by the department chairman. Quote, "You know why I'm interviewing you? It's because this year I'm reduced to the lame, the halt, the blind, and the women." Unquote. I think one can never forgive or forget such a callous and stupefyingly idiotic remark from one in power to one who is not. Here I should note that much of what I've been reading and relaying to you regarding institutional attitudes, tenure, grants, powerful males, departments, and so on, of course has to do with large universities, not small private colleges. My own experience as both graduate student and tenure-track assistant professor at large prestigious research institutions convinced me that I absolutely did not want to spend the rest of my professional life dealing with the intransigent, Neolithic, and powerful persons and groups that inhabit and operate too many of such places. It is one of the primary reasons for my personal choice of a small private liberal arts college, a choice I have never had occasion to regret. Well, this may all have sounded rather depressing, I suppose, but that's life. Change of the order required to make woman professor not a contradiction in terms is going to take a long, long time. But the very fact that you're here and I'm here, and that I'm able to cite the previous examples from published work means a great deal. It will be interesting in the year 2008 to see what further changes have been wrought in attitudes of students, of academic institutions, and of professors. Thank you. Questions or questions at the end, or? Yeah, Carol.
Patricia, I have really enjoyed your talk and the stress on the commitment to the world of ideas and professing ideas as a professor. And I wondered if you could say something about the situation where, if you make the comparison between the research university and the small liberal arts college, normally there's a little more opportunity and maybe a little more support for somebody who's interested in ideas and doing research at those larger institutions.
That is true.
And I wondered if you could just comment on that, especially in light of the fact that at Westminster we're talking about an increase in teaching load.
Yeah.
And the probability that we'll be less likely to be able to spend time thinking about ideas.
That is very true, yeah. It's a trade-off, Carol, is all I can say, because one of the reasons that I also wanted to leave a large research institution was because once I got out of graduate school and went to this place where there were like 9 million people in the English department, you know, I didn't even know anybody at the end of 2 years. There were something like 85 TAs in this place. It dawned on me as I looked around and really began to learn the landscape that I was going to have to toe the line and publish acceptable work in referee journals, that I couldn't do goofball stuff, the kind of stuff I like to do. I couldn't go off in all directions and do crazy stuff in science fiction because my degree was not in speculative fiction. I couldn't do the kind of Victorian things I wanted to do, which were again crazy underground kind of things, because that wasn't what my degree was in. One of the problems with, you know, the world of ideas in the great institutions is that the people in power have their notions of what the great ideas consist in. I mean, you know, the 6 years I was at Cornell, I watched one person after another not getting tenure, including some good men. Of course, they told them when they applied there that, I forget what the figure was, it was 1 out of 7 would get tenure, you know, and the others, forget it, goodbye. You know, write to me when you get DT Armpit Junior College kind of thing. And is that these people had published, they had published books, some of them, as well as a number of articles in referee journals. They weren't quite the kind of intellectual carrying on of the great tradition that the people in that department felt was valid. So there's that problem too at the great universities. It's not just that you're free to swim around in the great ocean of ideas. It's that you better have your inner tube supplied by them or you're going to sink. It's that's a terrible metaphor, but so you are freer at a place like this, but you haven't got as much time, and you haven't got the students who at the graduate level who know instantly what you're talking about when you make some vague, you know, kind of arcane references, and are able to, you know, in the humanities we don't really have lab assistants and that kind of thing. But you know, occasionally we get TAs given to us who can run off to the library and do the grunge work of looking things up and so on. We don't have that at a liberal arts institution, a small one like this. So, did I answer your question?
No, there's a trade-off. Either situation.
It's a trade-off, and I really, even with an increased teaching load, I still would prefer this, because there's such a bunch of hypocrites at those places. I spent so much time around them. You know, they make me sick. A lot of them. They're good people, but the institutions as a whole are. I mean, I'd rather live in San Marino than Italy. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but you know, what can I say? Luxembourg than Switzerland, I don't know. Yeah. Any other questions before I fall apart? Yeah. Nancy? Yeah.
Canon, do you find the move at Stanford then?
I'm sorry, what?
We're talking about the canon. Do you find the move at Stanford then to be encouraging?
The move to?
The move at Stanford to open up the Western civilization basic courses to works by third world people.
Yeah, I give it 5 years. It's been done everywhere. And then they narrow it back down again, because people like Alan Bloom, you know, get up and rant and rave and pontificate and so on. I'll bet you anything they'll narrow it down again. You know, they'll have, you know, a week of Li Po's verses, and they'll have, you know, Lady Murasaki, and they'll have a bunch of Indian folk tales and Hindu folk tales, and they'll have some South American stuff and some American Indian stuff and some African novels. And I'll bet you anything it lasts 5 or 6 years, maybe 8. I'm very cynical about that, you know. Anybody else? Whoever is next, I will.
Transfer the microphone.
Yeah, I'm passing on the great tradition. Yeah.